Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third of the Lionel Robbins lectures this year. And this is the one where you find out who done it and who the guilty people are. With the two previous lectures, some of you will have listened to. I have read the slides, which the first one was a completely comprehensible story. The second one, the slides, Philippe's going to explain them to me over dinner. So, but the third one, I'm told, is going to have much less maths. So those who can't bear to look at a slide without at least 2 sigmas on it can leave now. But it's on, as you can see, designing policies for growth, and it's really about culture this evening.
That's right.
So I'm hoping for a lively presentation, which for those of you who have listened to the first two, I know we are going to get. Before I ask Philippe to start, though, I should also, and it's a great pleasure to do this, welcome members of the Robbins family who are with us this evening, and it's terrific that the long connection between the Robbins family and the LSE is maintained through these lectures in honour of Lionel Robbins, and it's great that generations of the family continue to be in touch with the school. For those of you who've been to the early ones, you will know exactly who Philippe Aghion is. He is a professor at Harvard now. His interest is in growth policy and contract theory, and in fact bringing the two together now. He's been at Harvard since 2000. Before then, from 1996 to 2000, he was a professor at UCL. But you can see what a liberal school we are. We don't hold that against him. And we invite
University of London? Both are not the same. University of London?
Ce qui n'existe plus.
Oh, yes. He did at the time. He did at the time.
Yes, but that was before lots of things. Pre-crisis, anyway. We are delighted to have you here for the third and final instalment of this year's lectures.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here since Monday morning and to interact with PhD students, with colleagues. It's been very fruitful. And anyway, I'll keep having me memories of it. So now I need to have the how do I oh, I do it here today. Okay, it's a different technology. I have to. I'm very bad. I write on technological progress, but I'm extremely bad at it. And switching from. So I hope this says it has 6 slides. I hope the file has more than 6, but I think it's because But that would be dramatic if it. Yes, no, we are fine. Okay, good. Okay, so I will talk about policy and culture, and so there's been kind of, it's a very kind of, remember I think about growth policy making in terms of layers of growth policy making. The one is the Lisbon agenda, where you have this view that if you believe in new growth models, like we've been working over the past 20 years, you say, well, it's important to have research and higher education and innovation subsidies to have growth. And that's the kind of Lisbon agenda, if you want. And then people have understood increasingly that without structural reforms, for example, product market liberalization, organization of financial systems, labor market liberalization and things, you could not have much going on the first item. And we also talk about higher education organization, and I think that's also part of number 2. But then there is a kind of third layer, and that's the one I want to just touch upon today, because it's a huge black box, and I will uncover very little of it, and it's I think it's much more difficult to look at it. It's the layer of beliefs, trust, and social norms. And in fact, this came very much from me. People had started to work around culture, but for me to put it in the kind of a growth context is because, you know, when advising on the French, for example, government, I realized that in France a lot of the problem is the fact that, for example, in France people don't trust markets. in France, employers and employees don't trust each other. And that a lot of what makes it difficult to reform organizations, to do number 2 and therefore number 1, comes from barriers on number 3. You see what I mean? So somehow you have to deal with number 3 as well if you want to have durable effects on number 2 and number 1. But of course it's more complicated because 3 will be affected also by what you might be able to do on number 1 and number 2. So to bring culture into the picture is, I think, something very important. And then I had my only conversation with Sarkozy has been on this point, and in fact, but I'll tell you more when we have moved forward on the lecture. So now so I'm not the first one to think about trust and growth. For example, Easterly and Ross Levin had a paper 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that produced cross-country regression showing a negative correlation between ethnic heterogeneity, which they perceived as being a reflection, a factor of distrust, and growth, the cross-country growth regression. And then you have subsequent work. So, for example, in particular, the third one, Zach and Knack, consider a large sample of 41 countries, and on the horizontal line, what they have is a measure of trust, where they use surveys. So we will use a lot this survey, the World Value Survey, and you ask people of different countries all kinds of questions. For example, would you say that most people can be trusted? You would put 0 if the answer is that people can be trusted, and 1 if people say they can't be trusted. So it's a measure of distrust, but you can do it the other way around. And that would be the horizontal line, and the vertical line would look at average annual growth in per capita income in the country. So you have kind of individual surveys, you aggregate them at the level of a country, you get a kind of trust index for a country, for a certain wave. You did that, in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s. And you regress growth on this trust indicator, okay? And then you get something like this. That the higher trust is positively correlated with growth. Okay, so that's the cross-country growth regression. And the question is, of course, there are lots of questions. What are the mechanisms? What's going behind? What are the causalities? What explains? Is it a causality from trust to growth, from growth to trust? What are the mechanisms that underlie this relationship? Okay, so that what we try to do a bit is to look at potential channels for explaining this kind of relationship. So there have been work, for example, Dobke and Zilibotti have a recent paper which I think is very interesting. What they do is they look, culture for them is the propensity to save. You see, so for example, we know savings can be important for growth or for capital accumulation, and you have countries with high savings rate, countries with low savings rate, and they try to argue that the propensity to save or thriftiness or whatever is something that you get from your parents. Parents invest in transmitting values to their children, and they look at, first they try to really develop models where this happens, and marginally to look at implications for growth and convergence. But so that's a line of research which I mentioned in the book I just finished, which is I think very interesting, but that's not the one I will be talking about now. The one I will be talking about, because I want to relate it to my 3 layers, it's based on work I've been doing with 2 French colleagues, Yann Algan and Pierre Cahuc, and my colleague André Schleifer, and where we look at the relationship between various measures of trust or civic education on the one hand, and the extent to which countries deregulate or want to deregulate product and labor market. Remember, they say it's important for growth in a developed economy to deregulate markets, and you want to see somehow if there is a relationship between that and trust or civic education measures. Okay. So, for example, here I will show you a figure which comes from a previous paper, in fact, from just Cahuc and Algan. Schleifer was not yet on the picture. On the horizontal axis, you have, as before, a trust measure from the World Value Survey with this question: can you trust your neighbor or you cannot trust your neighbor? Okay, and that's average over 3 waves of the survey, not 2 like in the previous regression. And on the vertical axis, I have an index of regulation of minimum wage. So this index is done as follows. You have countries where you have high minimum wage or low minimum wage. So that's one aspect of whether you have regulation or not. But it's not just the level of minimum wage that may matter. It's the stringency of the minimum wage. For example, you have countries like France where you have a statutory minimum wage, the same everywhere. But you have countries where the minimum wage is allowed to vary across ages. So if you have a young and an old don't get the same minimum wage, sectors and occupations. So there are more flexible minimum wage. And so we constructed a measure which is the product of the level and this measure of flexibility of the minimum wage, and we call it regulation of minimum wage. And we see that countries which regulate more minimum wage are also countries with higher level of distrust, you see? And countries where you have lower regulation of minimum wage so for example, Finland, Sweden, the Scandinavians are here, you see? And who you have at the extreme northeast is France, you see? So that's where you are. And my view of what we should do in France, if we can, is to try to see, can France go from the northeast to the southwest of this picture? You see, so a lot of what we're talking about is to see, can we move France? Is there anything that policy can do? Is it a fatality? Is it something we can't do anything against? Because people will say France is a country of class struggle, you know, the hate between employers and employees will be there forever, like Gaza, whatever. Or you think, you know, that France, you can do something more like in Northern Ireland and reconcile les irréconciliables, and have something where you can somehow move more towards the Scandinavian way of doing things. And that's what I will be talking about a lot. So, so now I'll talk about this paper in particular, where we in fact, what we do in this paper, the first thing we do is that we say, well, it's true for labor market and trust, but you can look at other aspects, like product market. You can look also at court formalism. You can look at other aspects of regulation than just product market regulation. Labor market regulation. So we try to do three things there. The first thing is that we try to develop a model and to document more about cross-country positive correlation between stringency of government regulation and distrust. So we show that this positive correlation, which was you saw for the minimum wage, goes beyond that. It's true for product market regulation, court formalism, and other aspects of regulation. And then we try to develop a model, but when I say a model compared to yesterday, you'll see it's very, very, what we say, the terminology is Mickey Mouse model, you see? So it's a Mickey Mouse model, just to organize our thinking. So it's really a way to organize our thinking, and where we in fact, generate multiple equilibria. You have an equilibrium where you have distrust, and distrust induces regulation, but regulation also induces, discourages investment in trust, you see, and so you have the two-way causality. And so you have the bad equilibrium where you have high distrust, high regulation countries there. And then you have another equilibrium where you have high trust and low regulation, and we will see that you can generate Sweden and France as a different equilibria, you see, of a otherwise similar model. Okay, so that's the first thing we do. And the byproduct of the model will be to explain why is it, and that's something we will see in the data, because there is a kind of enigma that will pop out, and the enigma is that when you look at countries where you have high corruption or relatively low trust, and you ask in this country, and also low trust not only in other people, but low trust in government, low trust in justice, low trust in parliament, and you ask people in these countries, would you want more regulations? And they say yes. So that means they want more regulation, which are enforced by people who are whom they distrust. How come? How come you ask for more regulation to be in fact in the hands of government officials whom you know will bribe you? Will ask you to pay bribes, so you bribe them, but they will take bribes. That's what I mean. That's right. They are sensitive to bribes. That's what I mean. Okay. So that's a kind of question that we want to understand. So you have all kinds of literature on that, and I don't want to go through this literature because you'll fall asleep by the time I go to the second line. So really what we do is this. I mean, we want to document and explain the two-way relationship between distrust and the role of government in the economy, and why is it that people in countries with bad governments want more government intervention, okay? So the outline of the lecture will be as follows. I will first show you some data and correlation between distrust and regulation, okay? So just to motivate you, to warm you up a bit. And then I will go through, can I say, a model, but you see, really compared to yesterday, you will laugh. Huh? It's really a very simple model. It's just a way of organizing thinking. And then the model will have 3 predictions, and one prediction will be, and so the correlation, but I will try then to provide empirical evidence that explains things that the model predicts. So it will predict this multiple equilibria. It will predict that people want more regulation in countries where you have more corruption and less trust, but also it will predict something about transition economies. It will say if you start from a low level of trust and you deregulate, you might think that that would bring you towards the Swedish equilibrium, but in fact it will bring you towards the French equilibrium. Trust will go down by more. And we will look at the experience of transition economies to see that in fact EBRD and we look at the transition economies to see that's exactly what's happening in transition economies. So we might be, maybe one day if you see more regulation in transition economies, you will remember this lecture. Ah, yeah, the guy had predicted it, but maybe, so that's what I want to do. Okay, so now I start. I want first to show you correlations between distrust and regulation. So how we measure distrust? So we have world value surveys for 1980, 1990, and 2000, and you ask people questions. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you need to be careful in dealing with people? Okay, so that would be a question. Do you think that it's justifiable to cheat on government benefits? That's a measure of uncivicness. And then there is a question that has to do with distrust in institutions. Do you have confidence in major companies? Do you have confidence in unions? Do you have confidence in parliament, in legal system, in civil servants, in justice system? And that's the institution type. And we will look at all those guys as our trust or civicness measures, okay? So that's on the trust side. But now remember that I want to look at the regulation side. So I will look at product market regulation. So for example, one way to measure the extent to which you deregulate is to ask how many administrative barriers firms have to face when they want to open, you know, when an entrepreneur wants to start a new firm, how many days it takes him on average to get the green light. Okay, so that's the kind of Jankov, Schleifer et al. Had a measure of this. But we use also another one, which is the frequency of price control by the state, and that's another index of regulation of product market, which also works equally well to this one. So you can use various measures. You could use also just straight product market competition, but we want really to use the idea that you have kind of regulation index. Okay, so that's the product market regulation. But you also have labor market regulation. So labor market regulation, you have an employment rigidity index by Botero et al., not the painter, another one. And the index aggregates 3 areas. So difficulty of hiring, rigidity of hours, difficulty of firing. So that makes, you use that and you make an index called employment rigidity index. But we also use the index of state regulation of minimum wage, as I showed before, as another index of regulation on the labor market. And then you have something called court formalism. You know, the idea that are you more like the French, we are very formalist, although now Sarkozy is making it more informal, which means essentially I substitute to the judge. He wants to be everybody. He wants to be a prime minister. He wants to be the speaker on the television. Now he wants to be the judge as well. So I don't know if that's speaking that we are more formal or less formal. Depends on the personality of the guy. But the formalism of the legal procedures is another measure of regulation. And we look at the maximum sample of 57 countries. So look at this. That's trust and distrust and regulation of product market, and that's a cross-country regression. And you see there is a positive correlation, and you have a highly positive correlation between the two. Okay, and you can see that you always have at the low end you have the Nordic. Okay, they have low regulation of entry and high trust, but France. You see France, Mediterranean countries, Latin American countries are on the upper end, you see the high distrust and low and high regulation, okay? So now, regulation of labor market, same thing. You see the same countries essentially, well, Finnish, Norway, it's true, these ones are a bit above and the main line, but they are still on the low distrust and relatively lower rigidity of employment, whereas you would see countries like France typically being more to the right hand. alors it's true that Norway, Sweden, to some extent are a bit above here. When you look at regulation minimum wage, they are more together with the line. So here, for some reason, they are more rigid vis-à-vis certain things, but minimum wage, they are less. So that's interesting to just notice that. And there is the distrust and court formalism, and there again you have a positive correlation between trust and court formalism, and I think it should be distrust there, I think. Yeah, distrust, not trust. There is a typo there. So that tells you a bit about and there is another one, is distrust in justice. So for example, so far I showed, yeah. So now what we do here is that we'll show tables, so we show regressions. So here what you have is that you look at distrust measure and the regulation, and there's the regression corresponding to the previous lines that you saw. And you saw that, you know, in each time you have statistically significant correlations, and you control for education, log of population, log of GDP per capita. We also checked for effects of democracy and ethnic fractionalization, and none of these variables are statistically significant once you put trust in the regression. So that's what you get from this. So you see this very but the next thing that I will show you is that the distrust is not just distrust in others, it's also distrust in the institution. So you see, for example, here I put regulation of product market, and I regress on the distrust successively on distrust in institution, and you can see that you have positive correlation between each of those. So you typically have more regulation in countries that distrust more, also institutions, and that's the thing which was a puzzle for us. How come you want more? How come you have more regulation in situations where you have more distrust? Or maybe you could say because the government imposed the regulation on you, even if you don't want it, and especially because he wants to bribe you, and without the regulation he could not bribe you. So the government would impose the regulation on you to be able to bribe. But we will see that there is more to that. In fact, that people demand regulation in these countries. So that's what will be the thing. For the moment, you can't see that because you just see the equilibrium outcome, but we will get into demand for regulation later on. You see, but that's kind of striking this positive correlation between regulation and distrust in institutions. Okay. So now I move to the model now. So the model is again, I want to explain three things. In fact, I said two, but it's three. I want to explain the interplay between distrust and regulation. So is it causality in both directions? What's going on? The multiple equilibria. I want to explain why people with bad governments want more government intervention. And I want to explain, third thing, why in low trust economies, like the socialist economies were, once you deregulate them, instead of moving towards more trust, you moved in fact towards less trust and more demand for regulation in these countries. And I want to explain, the model will generate that, and I will of course then go back to the data and show that the data that we have at least suggests that this is that the predictions of the model are borne by the data. Okay? So the main features of the model I will show. So just to put you in appetite, people choose whether to become civic or non-civic. Okay, so the idea that at the beginning of your life, here you could say parents and children, but here you live for one period, and we don't have parents and children, but you can turn that into a parent-children story. You choose whether to become civic or non-civic. So, civic or non-civic, think of non-civic, you know, like non-civic is a kind of, family type of civic. You are civic within the family, but you are not civic outside the family. You see, like what you teach in the mafias. You teach to be civic inside, but not civic outside. And civic, what I call civic here, is that you are civic with the anonymous. You learn how to be good even with people who are not your brother and your sister. Okay, so that's two ways of learning about civicness. So, so then what you do is that the third thing is that the second feature is that productive activities generate negative externalities if people are on civic. So that will be a model where when you are on civic, you pollute, okay? You exert bad externalities on others. Either you pollute the others, you make noise, you make them less productive, you produce goods of bad quality and they go into indigestion, or you reduce their life expectancy, or you don't pay tax, and that has a negative externality on the rest, okay? So that's what I will be interested. And then you have the fourth thing is that regulation requires officials whose trustworthiness reflects that of society. So the idea is that you can vote the regulation, but to enforce it, you need government officials and some of them are civic, and some of them are non-civic, in a fraction which reflects the fraction of civic and non-civic people in society. Okay, so that's the features of the model that we are talking about here. So, there is a continuum of risk-neutral individuals. Individuals are producers during the day, and they serve as public officials at night. So there are two different moral values. You can have limited morality, that's what I call non-civic, or generalized morality, you see? And whether you are civic or non-civic is private information, and I did it by alpha, you see? That's my only use of Greek in this whole model, okay? The share of civic individuals in society, but of course you don't know, since we all choose to be civic or non-civic at the same time, we don't know exactly what alpha is. We can have expectations, and rational expectations on it, but we don't exactly observe it because we don't know what the other one are doing in terms of civic and non-civic investment. I experience someone, and then I find out if he's civic or non-civic. Okay, so that's the thing. Now the production is as follows. You have what we call routine workers, and routine workers produce an output which I normalize at 0. You see how simple it is. But then on top of that, I can become an entrepreneur, provided I'm allowed to produce as an entrepreneur. If I'm allowed to produce as an entrepreneur, I produce an additional Y, but Y is not the same for everybody. You have, it's drawn from a uniform distribution between 0 and 1. You have the very unproductive with Y close to 0, and you have the productive with Y close to 1, and in fact you can have any range of productive and unproductive between 0 and 1, okay? And in addition, civic entrepreneurs get an additional utility epsilon that can be as small as you want. It's just to break ties. And there are various ways to justify epsilon. It can be interpreted as a small private benefit. For example, if producers require cooperation, production requires cooperation between individuals over time, then you get an additional epsilon. Or for example, you are civic individual, and suppose with some probability, someone would come and even if you produce and would stop expose your production, you are less likely to be stopped expose if you are civic than if you are non-civic. You see what I mean? And that would be the kind of epsilon that I'm putting here. Okay, so now the uncivic individuals, let's look at uncivic and civic individuals in more detail. The uncivic individuals, they impose negative externality, which I call small e, per individual when they produce. And the other thing bad they have is that they demand bribes when serving as officials, you see? And also they are happy when they are producers to ask for production in exchange for bribes. So there are three things about them. They impose negative externality when they produce, they demand bribes when they serve as officials, and when they serve as producers, entrepreneurs, they may be ready to bribe an official to get the right to produce. That's a non-civic guy. Then you have the civic guys, they exert no externality in production, they never accept a bribe when they serve as officials, and they don't pay bribe in exchange for the permission to produce when they are producers, okay? That's the difference. Okay, so now the regulation. So the regulation is something that the society votes. The society can vote whether we or not we want regulation, because I'm very interested when I talk to Sarkozy. Remember always my dialogue with Sarkozy. I tell Sarkozy, look, if you don't have trust in society, and you have a lot of distrust, tomorrow people may ask for new regulations. You are deregulating today, but tomorrow people may vote for regulation. So there is here a vote for regulation. And the regulation, in fact, either you vote for authorizing production, and in that case there is no regulation, and in that case you don't need officials to enforce the regulation because there is no regulation voted, or you vote for a regulation, in which case production is legally forbidden, and then you have officials that make sure that it is, but of course the uncivic officials can be bribed, and they can say, well, produce, you know, no problem, I close my eyes, and the regulation is enforced by officials. So the regulatory rules the civic officials, as I said before, will always enforce the rule. The uncivic officials ignore the rule, they authorize production if only if a certain bribe is paid, and we'll see how they set the bribe. Okay? So the timing of events is as follows. First, individuals choose their type in every period, and some of that, you know, but I look at one period. Individuals choose their type of education, civic or uncivic. Then people vote for authorization or regulation, whether you should prohibit production or you should not prohibit production. And then all people produce if there is no regulation. In case of regulation, we know already, I'm repeating all the time, but then now you should know by now, civic officials implement the regulatory rule, uncivic officials authorize production by anyone who pays the bribe, and civic producers never pay bribes, and abstain from production, non-civic producers pay the bribe and produce with negative externality if the bribe is not always, they pay the bribe if the bribe is not higher than their productivity. The low Y guys will not produce because if Y is less than the bribe, okay? But the high Y guys will produce. So now that's the model. You see, it's not too complicated. Huh? There is no exponents, complicated things. There'll be exponents, but not complicated. So now I solve the model, okay? So solution of the model. So that's a game, okay? And I can solve by backward induction. So it's so I first consider step 3, and then I move back, okay? So I look at the stage where you suppose that you are at step 3. So remember, step 1, people choose to be civic and civic. Step 2, people vote for either regulation or no regulation. And step 3 is this step, is whether, you know, the bribe setting. So step 3, in step 2, individuals voted for no regulation, then everybody produces in step 3, and that's it. I mean, that's easy in that case. What's interesting is what happened in step 3 when you voted for a regulation in step 2. So suppose you voted for regulation in step 2, and now you are an official and you are a non-civic guy. Well, I have a non-civic guy, so I know that with probability 1 minus alpha, I will face a non-civic, not non-civil producer. Now, if I set a bribe, I get B times this in expected terms. But of course, I get bribes only from people who have Y greater than B. But remember that Y is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1. So the probability that the probability that Y is greater than B is just 1 minus B. You see? And that's so you just maximize this expected return. If you set too high a bribe, you have very few producers that will want to pay the bribe. So that's the way you want the bribe too high. If you set the bribe too low, it's not good either. And in fact, with this, you set the bribe exactly in between at 1/2. Okay? And that's so that you can strike the right balance between, you know, having enough people paying the bribe and getting a bribe, which is not ridiculously low. Okay? So that's how your bribe is set. It's 1/2. So now you start, you go back to the decision to whether or not to regulate. So you look at, so in fact the society will go for regulation whenever the aggregate output, the aggregate utility from the regulation is bigger than from no regulation. And you can derive, if you've done some political economy, you know that with the medium voter model, you can generate, in fact you can generate that with a random voting model. You can generate exactly this outcome. Voting is assumed to lead to socially preferred policy. For example, if you have a probabilistic voting model, so if you have a probabilistic voting model, you would generate that as a voting rule. So I just look at the aggregate. So let's look at aggregate output net of externalities if you have regulation or no regulation. So if you have no regulation, you know that people are uniformly distributed in terms of productivity between 0 and 1. So you just take the average productivity. Okay? Minus, you know that 1 minus alpha fraction of individuals will be uncivic and therefore will impose a negative externality E. So the A, so that's why you have A minus, so that's why you have this 1 minus alpha E there. So that's the aggregate output net of externalities when you allow production, when you don't vote regulation. Now when you vote regulation, what happens is the following. Is that in principle, if you had no corruption in society, you should have 0, because there will be no production, no externality. But in fact, there will be production because you have uncivic producers meeting uncivic civil servants. So what is the probability that a non-civic official meets a non-civic civil servant is 1 minus alpha times 1 minus alpha. You need a coincidence, no? We need to be both bad guys, no? That's 1 minus alpha squared, the probability. And now, when this happens, what will happen is that only those individuals with Y greater than the bribe 1/2 will produce. So that will be the production net of per individual work set, net of externalities. You see, so when you solve, you get this, which is a negative number. But this number is not always lower than the other one. In fact, you can compare the two expressions, and you get this figure. You see, so it all goes there. And now you will already see how the model works. So the model works as follows. So here you see that's the A. That's the straight line is as a function of alpha. So alpha is the share of educated individuals. So low trust societies are with alpha there. High trust societies are with alpha there, okay? And then what you have is that you see that for low levels of alpha, in fact, it's better to regulate than not regulate. Even though there are bribes paid, why is that bet bigger? Because it's true that you have corruption. It's true that the uncivic officials let some producers produce, but at least those with Y less than 1/2 don't produce. So they bar production by the low productivity people. It's true that they want the high productivity guys get runs from them, but at least to get these runs from the other one guy, they prevent others from producing. And that is of such high value when you have a very low level of trust. So that's why the R curve is above the A curve for low values of alpha. And of course then it crosses, and for high value of alpha, R is always negative, whereas A becomes positive, you see? And you see you have an alpha star there, you see? So typically what will be interesting is to distinguish when you start from an alpha which is less than alpha star, and I call that a low trust society, okay? And when I start from an alpha greater than alpha star, which I call a high trust society, okay? And if you have that picture in mind, you already get the model. This will deliver the whole predictions. This picture, so just try to look at this picture, because everything is there, okay? Of course, when will you vote for A? So whenever alpha is greater than alpha star, you vote for no regulation, and when alpha is less than alpha star, you vote for regulation. Okay, so that's step 2. Now I go back to step 1, and you look at I am a guy, I'm an individual. I don't know yet my why. Okay, so I suppose you decide whether you become educated or not before you know your productivity, and you ask yourself, you know, should I become or not civic? Of course, it all depends if you anticipate a regulation to be voted at stage 2 or not, because you know that things will not be the same. So if you anticipate no regulation in step 2, and you decide to become civic, you get the average Y, because Y is uniformly distributed between 0 and 1, so on average, your Y is 1/2, plus epsilon, which is my little plus of being civic, minus, you know that you get the externality 1 minus alpha E, so that's your expected utility of being civic, when you expect no regulation. But if you expect regulation, of course, you expect that you will not be authorized to produce, and therefore, yeah, you just get, there what you get is why you get this expression there, because it's you get the minus alpha square, which is a probability that a non-civic individual, a producer, meets a non-civic civil servant, okay, which pays the bribe, and that's 1 minus alpha square over 2, because only half of the producer pay the bribe, conditional upon this double coincidence, okay, times the E, and that's where it comes from, okay? Now, if you become non-civic and you expect no regulation, you have the same as before, except that you don't have the epsilon. But what's interesting is what you get there. So that's the only expression. I just have to tell you 2 words about it. You get this expression, which is a bit more complicated, but it has very simple interpretation. This part is the part that you get if I decide to be non-civic, with some probability, 1 minus alpha, I will be producing. But only if I have a Y greater than 1/2, I will truly produce. So this is in fact 1 minus alpha times the Y minus 1/2, the expectation of that, given that your Y is greater than 1/2, and that gives you 1/8 actually. You see, because you know the bribe, you anticipate the bribe of 1/2. So that's your expected gain from being a producer. You see, with some probability, I'll be a producer which can produce because I will face an entrepreneur, a civil servant who is non-civic, and that's what I get from it. This part is the part that you get from being a civil servant who will meet a non-civic producer, you see, and therefore can get the bribe. So the probability that being a non-civic guy, you meet a non-civic producer, it's 1 minus alpha, but then you have to multiply by the fact that you get the 1/2 bribe only from producers which have Y greater than 1/2, which is only half of the producers, and that's why you get 1/2 times 1/2, and that's the 1/4. So that's what you get from the prospect of being a non-civic producer. That's what you get from the prospect of being a non-civic civil servant. And you know that you do one at daytime and one at nighttime, you see? And that's the negative externality as before from this. So that's the thing. So that's the decision to be civic or non-civic. So now we have everything in a model. Now that's it. No more math. Now we just reason. Okay? So now we say, okay, suppose that you anticipate that alpha will be less than alpha star. So then if alpha is less than alpha star, people then anticipate that there will be regulation or no regulation? Regulation. So they anticipate regulation. Okay. So, so if they anticipate regulation, they say, well, I anticipate, going back to before, that I have to compare between, oh, it's a pity I don't have a Beamer today. It was nice before it was, with the, yeah, so can I do this? No, I cannot do this. We don't have a stick there. You can jump. This, I can't, I'm too short. No, it's okay. But you see what I mean? So you see that, of course, if you anticipate regulation to be voted, you prefer to be on civic because you get in addition 1/8 of 1 minus alpha plus 1/4 of 1 minus alpha. Okay? So in that case, if you anticipate an alpha less than alpha star, everybody will decide, in fact, to become on civic, and alpha will be, in fact, equal to 0. So in fact, the only stable rational expectation equilibrium, that's the jargon, for those of you who are not in economics, it's to forget about this, the only stable equilibrium there is conditional on thinking that there will be regulation, is alpha equals 0. So in that case, you get alpha, the one self-fulfilling equilibrium where you have alpha less than alpha star is alpha equals 0 in regulation. That's the French equilibrium. Okay? And then, now, suppose now that the expectation is that alpha is greater than alpha star. So you anticipate there will be no regulation. So if you anticipate that there will be no regulation, you go back to the previous slide, and you compare the first line with the third line. And you see that, of course, you would prefer to be civic because you get the additional epsilon. So maybe that in that case, everybody will decide to become civic, and therefore alpha equal 1, and that will be the corresponding stable equilibrium, okay? So that the model can explain, the negative can explain Sweden, the coexistence of Sweden and France, okay? We can explain the above negative correlation between trust and regulation. High trust countries are also countries with low regulation. And in French we have an expression, we say vice versa, we say lycée de Versailles. It's a stupid way to say it. Okay. So that's the prediction. The first prediction is this correlation, this multiple equilibria. You can have Sweden and France, okay? But now you have additional prediction, is that, as I mentioned before, and we go back to the model, distrust drives the demand for regulation. In low trust society, in fact, in the alpha equals 0 society, or low alpha, I know that the government is corrupt, because there will be corruption there. I know that the government will be corrupt, because there is a big incentive to become on-civic, and therefore you will have corrupt civic servants. Yet, it prevents negative externalities by unproductive. Yet, I know that my on-civic guys, my on-civic civil servant, they set the bribe by 1/2, they prevent production from the low productivity guys. So, in fact, that's one interesting. So they have a social role also there, you see, even though they are corrupt. And there is another thing also which is interesting. In a low trust society, think of alpha equals 0, which is there, or low alpha. What happens is that even though regulators are corrupt, society wants more regulation and further restriction on entry. In fact, what you would like to do, you see, is if you are there, it's a really pity I don't have the Beamer today. Oh God. I should want to go from, suppose I start from there, or I'm there. I would want to move to the horizontal line. How would you move to horizontal? By saying all production is totally forbidden. You would demand more enforcement of regulation. That's why you have demand of regulation in this low trust. Because you would like to move from here to the horizontal line, you see? That's the second prediction of the model, okay? And then there is another one, which is educational values such as tolerance or selfishness are negatively correlated with distrust and regulation. When there is high regulation, you don't invest. In certain kind of values. So that's the other thing that came from the model. Okay? But now there is another one, and that's the one of transition. So, and I say, well, you know, suppose I would like to explain the thing transition from central planning to market economy. How would you represent that? So I move to the same thing, but I just put this P and P prime. So what would be? How could you represent central planning? You could represent central planning by saying we forbid any kind of entrepreneurship. So if you forbid any kind of entrepreneurship, then what happens is that you get 0. Okay, you start from point P, for example, low level of trust and no entrepreneurship at all. So you start from P. Now you decide to do transition in Russia. Okay, So you are in Russia, so Soviet Union is at P. And then you do Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and that brings you to P prime, okay? And what happens in this, in fact, is that the transition, what it did is to allow private entry, but it relied on expensive and often corrupt regulation. So what you do is that now entry is allowed, but of course corruption will be increased. So you move to P prime now. And what the model predicts is that at P prime, corruption rises, of course, and people demand more regulation because you want to go back to P. So you've moved to P prime, and as a result, you've moved the demand, you've increased the demand for regulation, and we'll see that's what's happening. But there is another thing, is that you don't stay at this alpha there. You will move to alpha equals 0, because if you move from this equilibrium, this is unstable. You move to, in fact, alpha equals 0. So what will happen in this country is that you will divest in social capital. You will trust will go down. People will invest even less in social capital, and that's the prediction that you have. So unless you have incentives to invest in social capital separately, you are moving the society towards lower trust and lower investment in social capital. And the whole question there is that, can you deregulate and do other things at the same time to prevent this perverse effect? You see, so a very stupid vision of the first regression I would have given you would have been to say, you have Sweden versus France, so that's very easy. Deregulate France and you move to Sweden. But that's not true. You may move to in the other direction. You may need something else. And my view between you and me, so I don't know, Tony Giddens used to be the director of the LSE, and why do I like Tony Giddens? Because I think Tony Giddens tells me that somehow the third way is to say, well, you want to deregulate, but you want to do something else. And the something else is what precisely will prevent this kind of movement. And that's my interpretation. You see, that's my graphical. Of course, there is much more in Tony Giddens. But I think at least one of the things I get from Tony Giddens is that that way I could tell the story. You say you want social capital, you want some other things, like the Scandinavian, they invested heavily in human capital. They invested heavily in facilitating trust between social partners. They did other things that would make the deregulation not having this kind of perverse effect. You see, so I think that you really talk about the making of society there. Okay, I don't want to look like Obama, let's remake America and all that. Okay, so now we have these predictions. Let's look whether they are born by the data. Okay, and now we'll say, well, if you hate value surveys, you should leave the room right now, because it all relies on value surveys. I'm sorry, and that's what we have, that's what we use. So what we want to do, the first thing we want to do is to say, I would like to say, well, I would like to know whether distrust increases the demand for regulation. Why is it that you observe more regulation with more distrust? It also reflects the fact that you have this demand. You want to go from P prime to P, and I want to get evidence of that. So we have the data in the World Value Survey. We have data on political support of regulation. So for example, you have questions like this. Do you think competition is good? Or do you think it's bad and it brings the worst in people? So the lower score, 1, indicates higher level of distrust of competition, 10, high level of trust in competition. Government should give freedom to firm or control firm. Again, between 1 and 10, the higher score, the stronger support for government intervention. Government or individuals should take more responsibility. If you think it's government, it has maximum score. If you think it's individual, it has lower score. In democracy, does the system economic runs necessarily badly? So again, there you might think democracy is good or bad. It's very interesting to ask the Russians. Are you happy with Putin? Or do you want more democracy? You see, it's a very fair question. I mean, isn't Putin an outcome of the... I don't want to justify Putin, but you know, if there is an issue there, the average Russian guy, how would he answer the question? So, on the role of government, you can go more in detail. There is the ISS-PIF survey, which is International Social Survey Program, and it compiles surveys devoted each year to different specific topics: religion, social networks, role of government. And here I look at role of government. It's carried in 91 and in 96, and I average over the two. And for example, here is a list of potential government action for the economy. Control prices by law, control wage by law. Do you think it's good or bad? Do you think electricity should be run by government or private companies? Do you think that hospitals should be run by government or private companies? Do you think that banks? Well, that's of course that of course the answer. Now we forget the last question, because I guess now if I ask that in England, everybody we know the answer will be since partly yesterday. No? But that's funny. No? But So now what you have here is that we look at these guys, okay? And you see that countries where you have higher level of distrust are also countries where people more numerous to think government should control wage by law. So there is really a demand for regulation. And you can look at all the other things and do diagrams like this. But now I show you a regression, and that has all the things. So here I look at various measures of distrust on the column. Distrust others, distrust legal system, distrust civil servants, distrust companies. And then you get the answers to how many people believe that competition is harmful. And you see that everywhere you have positive and significant correlations. The more there is distrust, either in other individuals or in institutions, the more you think competition is harmful, the more you think government should control firms, the more you think government should take responsibility, and the more you're against democracy, you see? And that's what you get from here. So now I go to the second thing, which is the transition. Okay, you remember my thing. And you are in a transition, you start from a low. How long do I have? Minus how much?
we normally finish by 8, so we've still got 35 minutes.
Oh yeah, no, but in the talk, yeah, but I think...
But we need to do questions.
We need questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so here I remember it's a transition economies. I want to say the story. Suppose you have a socialist economist that start from low alpha, but you could tell me, who tells you they start from low alpha? Maybe your socialist economy started from a high alpha. So you have to explain to me they start from a low alpha. And then I say you liberalize, and you have certain things happening with like increase in distrust, demand for regulation, and increase in corruption, okay? So I want to make my case that that's what happened. So again, I go back to the World Value Survey. There is another survey called LITS, L-I-T-S, by the EBRD, and we use also this other data set, and we get very similar results, but you're just using the World Value or the LITS, okay? So there is much, and in the paper that's the support for this talk, we have a number of regressions run on using the LITS data set. So we compare attitude toward regulation, corruption, social capital between two waves of the value survey, 1990 and 2000. So, and you ask a question on corruption, do you think corruption can be justified or not? And should you think it's good or bad, it's okay to accept a bribe, so you have measure of corruption on those grounds, and we'll get back to that. So, but what we do here, the first thing we do here is to get is to see how the fact of being a transition economy affects distrust. And that's a regression of distrust on the dummy 1, 0. It's 1, the dummy if you've been transition economy in 1990 or if you have not been. And you see that in 1990, you have more distrust when a country is in transition compared to other countries in the survey. You have higher level of distrust. You see, so typically transition economies are to the left of the average country. You see what I mean? The probability of distrusting others rises by 16.9% when the respondent is living in a transition instead of an OECD country. The probability of distrusting companies raises by 15.1 percentage points if the person lives in a transition economy instead of an OECD. And the effects are statistically significant at the 1% level. So that's a big thing. Here what we do is something a bit different. We look across not just transition as a whole, we look among transition economies. And what we do as a kind of jargon econometrics, it's we do a kind of an individual level regression of trust on individual characteristics, age, education, gender, income, political affiliation, and the country fixed effect. And what we capture here is the coefficient on the country fixed effect. The fact of being in a certain country, does it make you distrust more or less? And so it's the fixed effect that we use here to compare distrust, additional distrust. So the 0 level is Sweden. So I take Sweden as a benchmark. And you see that the previous socialist economy, and I'm still in 1990, so I'm still at the alpha 0, at the alpha in 1990. Huh? And you see that, of course, transition economies have much more distrust in 1990 than the other OECD countries, particularly the Scandinavian countries. Okay, so really, I am in a region of low alpha. Remember my diagram? When I had, oops, I went the wrong way here. Remember my diagram? I'm really starting from a low alpha. That's what these two figures, the table and the figures say. Transition started from a low alpha level. Okay? So now we start from there. Okay? So now you know what the alpha is. And now I look at the experiment going from P to P prime. And I want to argue that the data reflects this. Okay? So now what I look at is the transition. I compare between the distrust in 1990 and 2000. Whether you are a country which is OECD, that would be the first row, or whether you are a transition economies. And being a transition economies, you see what happens there is that in fact, so what's interesting is that the first row is OECD. So between 1990 and 2000, you see that the distrust in others have not changed much in OECD country, but in civil servants has declined. So in OECD countries, we have reduced the distrust for civil servants between 1990 and 2000. But you see now that when you are a transition economy, the thing is exactly reversed. Distrust has increased between 1990, which is the onset of transition, and 2000. You see? So in fact, starting from a low alpha, you see that alpha has gone down further. That's exactly what I was saying. You start from a low alpha, and liberalization, you see the transition, what happened in the transition has lowered the alpha. Okay, so that's what I'm getting from this thing. So that's the first thing I said. You know, human capital, social capital going down, trust goes down, and that's what it seems consistent with this. Now this one is another one. Is that you want to know about the demand for regulation. Has the demand for regulation gone up as a result of transition, as the model predicts? And the answer is yes, because you see in OECD country, the fact of being in transition. It's funny that competition is harmful even in OECD countries. More people believe that competition is harmful today than 10 years ago. But it's much more important in transition countries. And instead of should government run business, you have a significant increase in the share of people in transition economies in 2000 that says, you know, you should have the government run things. You see, so that's in fact that implies if you rescale the variables, you know, between 1 and 0, the probability of disliking competition has increased by 30% over the 90s in transition economies, and the support for government ownership of business has increased by 35% in transition economies between 1990 and 2000, which is enormous. Alors you can look also at the education row. You see, that tells you that of course people less educated are more likely to want to have increased their demand for regulation. You see, because the less educated are less protected by transition. Of course, those guys also want even more. But even abstracting and correcting for that, you still have the average guy wanted more regulation. Of course, the less educated, the more vulnerable, want even more regulation than the less vulnerable. You see? Okay. So the rise in corruption, remember we measured corruption, do you think bribes are good or bad? And again, rise in corruption, you see that, you know, between 1990 and 2000, in OECD countries, we think it's less justifiable to cheat on taxes. For example, in France, you know, now it will change because Sarkozy will control the judiciary system. You cannot go against a corrupt politician anymore since 1 week. But before you could, and that has been a trend in France and in various other countries in Europe. But what's interesting is that the transition economies now find accepting bribes more justifiable than in 1990 by a significant amount. You see, so that I think is interesting and it shows that it's a lot going for employment. You see, self-employed, a lot of it is from entrepreneurs actually. The self-employed are those who are most responsible for this trend. Okay, so now I want to talk about parental values, education, and distrust. So I talk about trust, and you could say, well, but in your model it's more like civic education, and you talk about trust or civil education. I want to show you that the two are related, and they are related to regulation, as I suggested. So we look, in fact, in the survey, in world value survey, you try to track values such as tolerance, unselfishness, respect for other people. And you ask people, here is a list of quality which children should be encouraged to learn at home. Which, if any, do you consider to be especially important? Tolerance and respect for other people, unselfishness, etc. And we get an index of demand for civic education. For this, it covers 50 countries, this picture. And there what you see is that, in fact, there is a negative correlation between distrust and the extent to which people think that children should be encouraged to learn tolerance and respect. So this variable is one-to-one with trust, you see. if I had put trust on the vertical axis, you would have, of course, a positive correlation, 1-to-1. Okay, so whenever you have countries which have more, where people are more in favor of civic education, also those are higher trust countries. Okay, so that's on the first thing I wanted to argue. So now I want to look at regulation of entry. Before I used to trust at regulation of entry and trust. And now I look at regulation of entry and whether children should be encouraged to learn tolerance and respect. And whether, whenever you think that children will be less, whenever you have, so where do we believe that it's more the case? Sweden, Denmark, the Scandinavian, that's where you think that children should be most encouraged to learn tolerance. And that's where you regulate entry less, you see? So that's so whatever I said on trust before, you can replicate with really this direct measure of civic education, okay? And here what you do, we regress distrust and regulation on civic education, okay? And so what you see is that civic education is negatively correlated with distrust, but it's also negatively correlated with regulation. And that's what I wanted. And what's interesting is that here we control for democracy, fractionalization, and GDP per capita, and those are non-significant in the variable, in the regression. You see, that's what we do. So now I'm getting there. There is another one I want to show you. And I want to show you about the change. I told you that there was a move towards less trust in transition economies. And you said, well, is it really reflecting an evolution towards less civic education? Now you could say, well, you showed us that there is a positive correlation, that's it. So I redo directly with the question on civic education. And what you can see is that between 1990 and 2000, in fact, in transition economies, you want, there is, less people want to believe that it's important to teach to be civic, you see? Whereas in the OECD countries, between 1990 and 2000, more people believe that it is important to teach values like civicness to your children. And now finally, I arrive at the last one. You want to know if the change in demand for social capital, in the fact that you had this perverse effect that in transition countries you want less to teach civicness to your children, if it comes from the old guy or the new guy. Is it just old guy? You see, one assumption could be to say, well, I am the old guy, I invested in civicness, but now, you know, the society is a society, you know, the good old days are gone, okay? There is chaos, I'm bad off, I'm losing, I've always been an honest guy, now I have low pensions, and I really believe, now I don't believe anymore in these values. You see what I mean? Because I put my investment, and look what happened to me, it's so unfair, hell with it, you see? That's the second assumption. The other way is to say, no, it's because the world has changed in transition economies, and there is less incentive for your children. You think that for your children, it's not so good to be so honest, because here is the world. In Russia, you make a lot of money, or in our countries, you know, by not being so honest, you know. And so you think now, because the world has changed, you should invest in younger generation in this way. So it's very important to know if what we observed in the previous regression was due to old or young generation. And so what we do here is that we, in fact, decompose by generation. We take the age 65 and more as a reference, and you see that all the effect, you see the distrust, but I could have said social capital, you see it's really coming from age 18-34, and a bit less 34-45, and not later on. So it's really the young generation that, you know, is really because it's the distrust among younger cohorts. You see that is the increased distrust among younger cohorts that's driving the result of the increase in distrust overall, and not among the old. So it's not so this really shows that it's not the all good day hypothesis, but it's really that you change the environment, and you suddenly, but the parents said, well, you know, maybe now we should not teach my son to be a teacher or a doctor, but to be a good whatever. You see what I mean? Something else, other skills, and that's what I think comes out of here. So now comes the final slide. And what do we get from all this? So that we get that deregulation can be good if people are civic, but can be bad if you have too many uncivic people. If you have a low alpha zero, deregulation without anything can be bad actually. It can lead you towards more demand for regulation, less investment in social capital. And the result may be that tomorrow you may face, in fact, new regulations. You see, there may be a big demand for re-regulating these economies. And in the long run, I know that in the long run you prefer to be in the Swedish equilibrium with more civic guys and less government regulation, than in the French equilibrium with more uncivic guys and more regulation. But the problem is to know how to go from the French to the Swede, or how to make the transition economies move toward in the Swedish way and not in the French way, you see? And I think that's a problem. So what could you do? Well, I believe in public education to raise the level of social capital. Scandinavian countries invest enormously in education. We've seen that for higher education, for example, in the first lecture. Another thing you can do is to invest in trust between social partners. You could tell people, look, your employees and employees, you make a deal. That deal will become the law. And we give you money. We reward you. That's not the way it's done in France. In France, the socialist government so far substitutes itself to the social partners. He said, well, you don't need social dialogue. I am the socialist government. I am the welfare state. I substitute, no need for dialogue, no need for meeting. I do the job. That's very bad in a sense, because you don't encourage trust building. I think you should now, the left in France, should really go into this business of saying, I have to help people helping themselves. How can you help people engage in dialogue with each other? How can I be a catalyzer of dialogue, not a substitute to dialogue? And I think that's the kind of route to do. There is another thing also. This trust in French enterprises comes very much from the Grandes Écoles system. Very often you have a boss. Either he's a boss because his father was a boss, so that when he was a bad pupil. When he was a good pupil, he went to Polytechnique. And then you have a Polytechnique guy. You know you have no chance to ever become an employer because you didn't go to Polytechnique. That creates an enormous barrier between employers and employees. And I think there is something to rethink about our education system and how it translates into the enterprises. Because you have, it's very hard, you see, that it creates a big divide between employers and big source of distrust. And maybe there again, you can. So my dialogue with Sarkozy was to say, you deregulate, but at the same time, the unions are very weak. And you didn't help, you almost started. At some moment, Sarkozy did something which I thought would be very good. He said, look, make an agreement between employers and employees, and if you make this agreement, I pass this agreement, I will propose this agreement in the parliament. And then they got an agreement, and Sarkozy reneged on his words. In fact, the labor minister was Xavier Bertrand, said, no, in fact, now you got the agreement, I will add certain things on the 35 hours. And for the first time, you had a delegation comprising CGT and the MEDEF, which is the employers' union, joined to go to see Xavier Bertrand, to see whatever, to protest this move by the government. Because they say, look, we were in the process of getting trust with each other, and now you are undermining it for ideological or electoral reasons. And that's very bad. And when Sarkozy said, well, this thing that you did, you should not have done, because you've undermined the trust, and the trust is a big part of the success of a deregulation reform, if you want to make that reform durable. And that concludes what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I was fascinated at the end when you were talking about distrust of managers. You chose as your example Polytechnique.
Yeah, that's not
which is the voice of the true École Normale person.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't be École Normale, right? Who'd like to ask, and if you could give your name as well? I think, yeah, you've got your hand up first. You could give your name, and there's a microphone on its way to you at speed. Great.
I'll answer your question about the data, no question about the model, if you can.
Yeah.
Well, listening to the way you talked about the French government, I wonder if you trust the government also. Why would you trust that data if the French are so mistrusted, as the level of trust is so low? Why would they even trust you to give you this data on which you rely?
No, because you don't ask officials to give you the data, you ask people.
Yeah, people themselves.
Oh, they could lie, you mean? They could lie about others?
Do you trust?
Oh, because you know it's anonymous, so you know why would you? You know, why would you lie to yourself? I mean, why would you? I mean, you don't. I survey people. I ask them, do you trust institutions? I don't ask institutions. So I ask people, do you trust justice? Do you trust each other? And they just say yes or no. There is no reason why they should. You know, you can always think that people lie, but I mean, any kind of survey you can ask that question. But there is not an obvious reason. There is not a obvious conflict of interest because nobody will know who they are. You see what I mean? It's anonymous. You don't say Mr. X said that. He will not go in no record.
Okay, thank you. The reason for that question was because if you do cross-country data and trust level...
No, we do individual and we aggregate by country. That's what we do. We don't ask the government. We do individually and then we average over the country level.
Yeah, then about the model, well, trust is it an exogenous variable? Because it seems to be that it is a result.
No, here it's a result. It's an equilibrium. So that's why you have the multiple equilibria. So you have some forces that determine whether you are. What would be the exogenous would be cost to become civic. So for example, the epsilon, or you could imagine that to become more civic you have a cost, or you can act on the cost. Those would be exogenous variables. But here the alpha is an equilibrium alpha. Those are equilibrium variables. So regulation and civicness or trust in the model are both equilibrium. So you have a two-way causality, in fact. That's what it means.
So
but which is underlined by, you have underlying parameters that determines more if I'm more likely to be on one or the other equilibrium.
Yeah, we could have a case where the trustworthy guy is behaving irrationally because he's not taking bribing, and the economy where bribe is.
Then you choose irrationality. Now here you assume rational individuals. So but the thing is that you could eliminate the bad equilibrium with policy. So it's a model where you have the two equilibria. But if you have policies, for example, let's say I subsidize a lot investment in social capital, or you could do various things, you could eliminate the bad equilibrium. You see, so that's the whole point of the model. It's a model of multiple equilibria where policy can eliminate the bad equilibrium.
Go down here at the front. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for 3 days of wonderful lecture. And in the introduction of your first lecture, you stressed the importance of labor market flexibility for growth. And I wonder how you can combine labor market flexibility with trust between employee and employers, in the sense that in the last year, labor market flexibility was a synonym of labor precarity. And in some European countries, Italy and France, there was a process of flexibilization that was translated into a shift of functional distribution from labor to capital. So you have some inequalization. If I can add another small question is, I can see how labor market flexibility between high-skilled labor can spur innovation and so growth. But it's harder for me to see how labor market flexibility among normal workers or blue-collar workers can actually increase innovation and so growth.
So on the first one, I mean, the idea there is to say, when you have trust, you can afford to deregulate because the social partners do it, you see? And the social partners have more incentive to invest in trust when they know they can produce more and they can get more out of the activities, you see what I mean? So that's the kind of two-way causality in general, you see what I mean? If I know that I have more incentive to invest in trust with you when we know that we are more allowed to do things. So if you have too heavy regulation, there is no incentive to invest in trust. But when there is also distrust, then I ask for regulation because I don't trust you and I want more regulation. So that's what creates this multiplicity but now labor market flexibility, how can you do it in a way that preserves trust? For example, that's why I believe in the Danish way. You see, you did a flex security system where you say, firms can fire and hire, but workers have insurance, and also you have a kind of bonus-malus system, like for example, Blanchard and Tirole have talked about for France, but that has been done in the US, where, if you're a firm and you abuse the right to fire people, you are of course penalized, you see what I mean? So it's a system that responsibilizes everybody. So you can design systems that force people to talk to each other, and to be responsible. And that I think the kind of things that we experimented in Denmark, for example, have also this aspect that you can put more flexibility in the labor market without reducing trust as much. But that would be interesting to look at that in more detail, whether in fact flex security has achieved that particularly. But you see, that's my own belief that you can do flexibility in ways that minimizes the scope, the risk of going into more distrust, because you have certain rules of the game to do. Fundamental rules of the game in which people can be flexible, but within certain limits, and they have to play on these rules. So
why you didn't take in account income inequality?
No, we did in fact. We controlled the thing for income inequality. So that of course, and that was very important, particularly for the transition thing. We took into account the Gini and the difference in education. Absolutely.
Next one over there, yes, go with the specs. Sorry, that's enough.
Yeah.
There with the hand up there. That's it, thanks.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. I would just like to ask, because your model was very much based on the real economy with the production, and I was just wondering, under the current financial crisis, how do you think that regulation applies to the service industry, and more particular, the financial industry? And do you see, because I see a model that would predict we might have some over-regulation, and we might move to the alpha becoming zero in your model. Just see what's your thought on that.
So it could be another instance, in fact. Maybe, I mean, I could use that as another example. Maybe when finance was deregulated too much over the past 20 years without having complementary investment in rules of the game and social capital. You see what I mean? It's maybe another example where, in fact, deregulation was done too quickly without enough complementary investments, and that led to what we have now, where you have a demand for regulation now, in fact, in the financial sphere. And now the big problem is that there is a risk that people will demand regulations in all things. They will also demand regulation on the product and labor market that maybe we should not be introduced as strongly as in finance. You see, you can have a backlash now. There is a big risk in developed economies that, in fact, because things went too far, because we didn't put complementary investment in social capital to the financial deregulation, now there will be a kind of excessive demand for new regulation, even to an extent that we don't want. And for protectionism and things, and that I think, so but that's very interesting that we can use also the financial. It would be interesting to see whether the model can be adapted or used to illustrate also the trust crisis that you have in, and also how government will maintain trust. You see how Gordon Brown will keep having trust of people. You see, we looked at, he knows what he's doing, and I think there it's important to say for the government, you know, I'm doing things that, you know, Scandinavian countries did in the 1990s. In fact, what Gordon Brown did a lot when he renationalized some banks, it was to redo what the Swedes and the Finnish did in 1990 when they had their banking crisis. And we know that that worked to some extent. So I think so when you tell people, look, I'm trying to use the best practice elsewhere, and that comes from this and that country, and I'm also investing in the social, safety net to make sure that the consequences will be minimized for people. I think that's a way to maintain trust. It's very important that government keeps, having the trust of the people in a time where new regulation have to be introduced like this. Yes.
Yeah, guy in the middle there.
Yeah.
Turbine bank. He's only nationalising Scottish banks. You do realise it's not an English issue, this. But
Thank you, sir, for the presentation. I'm Prakash at the LSE, and I just had a couple of points about your regression.
Yeah.
One was that maybe you didn't control for the fact that some countries may be more prone to conflict. So, for instance, some country may have had a conflict in the past 5 years, and that might affect...
Have had what? Have had? Conflict.
That might have...
Well, we control for fractionalization, for example,
Right.
variable,
Right.
which are correlated with conflict. So it's true we could put conflict. We could put conflict as directly as a variable. That we didn't do. That way we could try that.
Fractionalization actually
Yeah.
does not have an effect on conflict.
Yeah. Control directly for conflict. Yeah. That's a good idea.
And the other thing could be,
Yeah.
for instance, the technological shock. I don't know if you have more than 2 years to control for like year-specific effects, but you could have shocks that are sort of correlated across countries that affect both the level of distrust and the regulation. Technological shock, for instance, the emergence of the internet or I don't know, next social media.
That would have played a role of acting. But well, the internet revolution pushed towards less product market regulation. But when I compare I see differential evolution of countries between 1990 and 2000, and that's what I'm getting in this regression when I use these 2 waves. So countries have moved in general towards. So I see that but in different ways. And that's I try to capture the heterogeneity in response of countries to this common shock that you are mentioning. When I go from 1990 to 2000, I capture that partly. But the surveys, I only have 1990, 2000. I would love to. I have 80, so we could look at 80. So then we capture pretty much the wave and try to isolate what the wave did there. Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
Just right in front of you, shirt sleeves.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks. My name is John McDermott. All the trust data seems to be about, between people in the same country. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how important trust is across borders, because we've seen recently how important global deregulation is. And also if you're designing policies for growth, then you assume free trade, for example, is important.
Yeah. So that, in fact, is work that's been done already. There is always more to do, but Zingales, Sapienza, and Guizot have done very interesting work on trust across countries. And they found a very good instrument because you know, you always want, they looked at how trade volumes or growth depends on this trust, and it's positively correlated with trust across countries. So that's been done. And what's very nice in what they did is, thanks to that, they could look at an instrument for trust, and they use a genetic instrument. So if you're more similar genetically, you tend to trust more other people. I don't know why you should believe that, but they use that as an instrument. At least it's the first example of this kind of analysis where you have an instrument for trust. But it's very hard to do within countries. It's easier to do across countries. And that's what they've done. But that's done by them, by this Guizzo Sapienza Zingales work, which I think is very interesting.
Guys, just in front
yeah.
of Stripey.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a microphone just there. Just one second. Just there.
Yeah, my general questions, I think, if you may remember from last night, we're talking about globalization. Just really a follow-on from that. Obviously, Gordon Brown in the UK plays a lot of credence by suggesting his decision to recapitalize the banks is based on decisions made elsewhere. So therefore, taking that theory through, we add credibility to our decision-making processes by trying to compare what other nation states would do in a similar situation. Then leading that through to, we think it's a good idea to have some form of homogeneous response to what we now perceive to be a global issue. So in policy-making terms, obviously there is a movement towards greater comparative work between nation states, and therefore trying to justify our decisions based on that comparative work. Following that through, based on the type of discussion we've had tonight, where there is great differences, disparities between nation states on relevant factors which influence these kind of decisions. Obviously, there is a push towards a greater collective response to these kind of activities. Your data is suggesting that will be quite dangerous, and at the moment, national governments are, well, haven't quite gone as far as a collective response, but are taking bits of what they believe to be appropriate actions and working them through at a national level. So in relation to policy, where do you think all of that situates, and what do you think will happen going forward?
Yeah, in fact, the model, what I did today doesn't have much to say on the question, because it's, different countries, and I look at, what happens in the country on trust and regulation in the country. So I don't look at cross-border regulations or, but in general, I mean, what you are asking is that whether, there be the notion of trust across countries. I mean, that would be a different, should government trust each other and coordinate and have a, you see, I mean, the big question there is that the 30s generated a wave of, protectionism, non-cooperation, wars and things. And what can you do for this crisis not to lead to the same thing? And can you have a kind of coordinated action between governments, not have the US let the dollar go and without coordinating with the ECB, not have China play non-cooperative on exchange rate forever, and how can you have get some cooperation going out of this crisis? And I think that's a big. But the model doesn't speak to that, because the model speaks about trust of people in their institution or in other people in their country related to regulations in their country, even though regulations can change in a coordinated way across countries.
I think my point was really focusing on the fact that your model did bring out the cultural differences between countries, which in effect...
You could use, like between countries, said, for example, if you have distrust, you will go towards much more regulation. In that case, will be protectionism. You would say, if we don't trust each other, we become much more protectionist or much more. And how can you? So the kind of spiral you see in my model, you could see in the cross-country trust and regulations. And that's a question.
We take one last one. Yes, straight in front there.
I was just wondering what role inequality might play in some of this. I noticed you had Gini index on one of the slides, but it's not mentioned in the rest of the talk as far as I noticed. So it looks like I think it's gone off.
Yeah, I think
it could play a role in what you're talking about.
So for example, what I believe is that it would play, for example, social capital. It's true that one thing, as I say, education could be other device to reduce inequality, because if you have too many inequalities, you have a kind of divided society, and that's like having more distrust. So I would look also at Gini things. I mean, on the policies to complementary to deregulation, I might also be concerned that inequality don't be kept under control, you see? And that would be that because too much inequality deteriorates social capital. So that's how I would play it, is that I think what was the key to the success of Scandinavian countries is that they deregulated in countries where you maintain, for example, very progressive personal income tax. They reduce corporate tax, but they maintain very progressive personal income tax. And they correct inequality a lot. And I think that's part of the machinery. That's part of the social model. That's part of the social fabric.
Just that when you call it trust